Welcome back. This is week 7, lecture 1, February 1520, Luther's Break from Rome. And this lecture follows very naturally on the previous lecture dealing with Luther's theological breakthrough. And there I tried to present my case and the argument for and the evidence for um, Luther's theological discovery of passive righteousness as being distinct from his breaking from Rome, breaking from the papacy. And the problem has been, as I think I tried to explain, that scholars have always identified these two together, that his theological discovery was synonymous with his opposition to Rome and the papacy. It has also been referred to as his Reformation breakthrough, his Reformation discovery, as I referred to it last lecture too, the Tower experience, where he had this revelation of passive righteousness. And these two events were separate. And this lecture, I think, will then, I hope, demonstrate how that is indeed the case, and that his break from Rome, what really led to his saying, I can no longer be can no longer follow the Pope, can no longer follow the Roman Church, was a very different break and had different causes and catalytic events, as we'll see, than did his theological discovery. So that is what this is all about. Now, the readings for this week are the 95 Theses. And I think last lecture, one before, I said, with the when the theses against scholastic theology were assigned, I said, I should have been assigning the 95 Theses. And if I said I hadn't, I probably forgot that I actually had. So I think it is important for you to read through them. I know I've already talked about indulgences, and I'll talk a little bit more about indulgences today to begin with. But then the other source that is assigned for this week is the Address to the Christian Nobility of the German Nation. And that is the focus of text analysis too, which is coming right up. Now, that is a treatise I'll be mentioning today, but I'll be talking a little bit more about it also in terms of the text analysis in the second lecture. Now, one of the things too for this week, the second lecture for this week, that is, one of the things that we need to be aware of is that there is a difference between Luther's critique against the papacy, and first of all, his critique against indulgences, and when he becomes, quote unquote, a reformer. He certainly didn't conceive of himself as that. And even as I argue that he broke with Rome and the papacy and started actively fighting against them, it was not really until he finally took off his monastic habit in 1524 that he said, okay, I'm no longer an Augustinian hermit. But until that point, his attack on indulgences, his theological discovery of passive righteousness, and even his break from Rome, as I'll be discussing today, um, was done by Martin Luther Augustinian, a faithful, observant Augustinian hermit, at least in his own mind. And I talk more about this in chapter 7 of my Luther book, which is also part of the assigned reading for this week. But here I just want to kind of go through the steps with you more straightforwardly. If you've looked at chapters 7, 6, and 7, you'll see that I try to place Luther's thought on the church and on the Pope in the greater late medieval context, where I talk a lot about then Marsilius of Padua and then Jan Hus, who we'll be talking about today a bit. But here I just want to kind of go through it step by step as we go. So I hope that provides the kind of the context or the frame for the lecture today. And to do so, I'm going to start back with indulgences, which I think I've already, again, talked about, in that Luther was by no means the only person to attack indulgences. The indulgences controversy was something that Luther participated in, but again, he did not was not the first. I have it there on the slide: Origins and the Theory and Practice, and the Spark that lit the powder keg, and then papal involvement. And the origins, I think I mentioned, go back to the Crusades, when a prince or a king could say, I really don't feel like going, especially after the First Crusade, which was a success, but thereafter the others weren't. It's like, can I get out of it? I was like, well yes. You can pay for someone to go in your place. But payment, then you received an indulgence from your obligation to go. Again, even if I've already gone over this, I should probably just repeat myself somewhat in terms of the theory of indulgence, because this is so important and has so often been misunderstood. Luther, especially at first, did not attack the theory of indulgences. He was attacking the practice of indulgences. Because the idea that the Pope could say, okay, I will absolve you from this obligation I put on you to go on crusade if you make a commensurate effort by paying for someone to go in your place. Now, pretty soon that became applied to penances. If your penance was to go on a pilgrimage to St. James of Compostela, you could say, well, I can't really go. That's a big undertaking, a lot of travel. Can I do something else? I said, well, you can donate money to construct or help build the altar of your local church. So there began to be this sense of an indulgence from an imposed penance or the punishment. That's what the penance was about, absolving one from the punishment. But the guilt remained. But the issue was, I think our confession was, confessio oris, the oral confession, being contrite in your heart, and that was why penances were imposed, to make sure that you were actually contrite, that you were sorry for what you had done, and realized that you shouldn't have done whatever it was that you were confessing that you did. And then the satisfactio operis, or the performing the penance that is imposed upon you. And the Pope could not get rid of the guilt from the sin. But that penalty, that penance, was the concept was the priest, by means of the Pope, power of the papacy, imposed that penance on you. So it wasn't just something that God said you have to do, say 100 Hail Marys and 100 Paternosters. That is a human institution. And so the Pope could grant indulgences to get out of that. Now, it's only later on, in the 14th century, that then the theory came about, and later in the 14th century, in the 1368, I think it is, if I remember the papal bull that allowed this, that said that could also be applied to purgatory. Because purgatory is, again, simply the punishments or fulfilling the penances that were imposed upon you that you had not fully complied with, or not completed. If you were, if the priest said, okay, for that you have to say 100 Paternosters. If you only said 98, you lost count or something. Oops. You're going to spend time in purgatory working off those last two. But of course, in purgatory, time is eternal, and so it's might be 1,000 years in purgatory for having missed two Paternosters. It would take you 2 minutes at most to say. Probably if you really hurry to do it, with in under a minute. So it's like that is the theory behind it. And I talked about the economy of salvation. It was very much an economic. I'm not just saying money, but it's an economic exchange of this for that, and what is equivalent, and how do we go about judging and determining what is an appropriate penance for a given sin or crime. And Luther, even in his theses against indulgences, and in his then resolutions about his theses and indulgences, explaining what was behind them, he says, it's not the theory, it's the practice. And the practice became more and more objectionable, not only in terms of applying it to purgatory, but then in the later 15th century, the theory came about, and the papal bull proclaimed it, that you could apply an indulgence to souls already in purgatory. So it's not just for yourself, but you can do it for somebody else. And that was what really was a problem. That was where the abuses really came in. And this preaching of the indulgences with Johannes Tetzel to raise money for the building of St. Peter's was an abuse in every way, which way you could look at it. And I don't think any Catholic historian today would say, or theologian today would say anything different. It was a horrible abuse. And Tetzel was a slimy salesman. He'd come into town and preach and say, oh, okay, all you have to do is give what you can. Oh, you don't want to get an indulgence for yourself? What about your mother who's in purgatory? I couldn't stand my mother. She can burn there for as long as she wants. What about your little baby daughter who died? Yeah, I don't want that. All you have to do is contribute money, buy an indulgence, and get your little baby girl out of purgatory who's suffering and being tormented by demons. That's the type of horror that it actually was, and people were buying it and going for it, and that was the abuse that Luther stood up against, and that many people stood up against. And now the problem was that at the time, Luther was not as such attacking papal authority, except he did say in his theses against indulgences, as you read them, he says if the Pope has the power to get everyone out of purgatory and doesn't, that's just being cruel. If you remember, I talked about Augustinus of Ancona's Summa de Potestate Ecclesiastica, and he argued that the Pope does have that power. But the problem is not him being cruel. The problem is that the Pope doesn't have all the knowledge of Christ. The Pope has all the power of Christ, but not all the knowledge of Christ. And so, therefore, if the Pope did empty purgatory, if the Pope said, my gosh, I do have this power, so I'm going to actually use it, that would be wrong. That would be an error because the Pope doesn't have the knowledge that God has, whether or not that would be the right thing to do. But what Luther argues simply is if the Pope could and doesn't, that's cruel. So there's even a lack of Luther's understanding of the whole situation, of what that all meant there, in terms of based on his own order's political theology, as discussed by Augustinus. So the issue is, read the theses, but just read them in light of them being not Luther standing up against the horrors of the Roman Church, but he is trying to discuss an abuse and he was not the only one, but an abuse that affected his congregation, his flock, not just his own brothers in the monastery, but far more importantly and more dangerously, because the brothers weren't running off to get indulgences, the congregation in Wittenberg. And he was the pastor of the Castle Church. So it's this pastoral endeavor to say, my parishioners are being misled. And as I think I already mentioned, Frederick the Wise had forbade Tetzel to preach in electoral Saxony. But Duke Albert said, okay, it's fine here, dude. So in Ernestine, ducal Saxony, it was fine, but not, or in Albertine, ducal Saxony, it was fine, but not in Ernestine, electoral Saxony. That was the conflict. And the problem was, regardless of everything I've just said, papal theologians supporting the Pope at the time and everything, were read his treatises as an attack on papal power and papal authority. Because when Luther argues that the Pope does not have that authority, Augustinus of Ancona had, other papal theorists argue that they had, and so Luther comes along and says, no, he doesn't have that power. It's like, oops, that's an attack on the papacy. Luther didn't see it that way, but that's in effect what was going on. And so it becomes an issue not over indulgences, but over the power and authority of the Pope. And the Pope over sin, the power and authority of the Pope to grant indulgences, to grant forgiveness and absolution, and on what bases, and how do we handle these issues? That was what was behind the indulgences controversy that Luther stood up about. Now, I also argue that he had already had his theological breakthrough by 1517, by December 1514, of passive righteousness. And that just plays into it, makes it even all the more problematic, because if you have a view of active righteousness, where you must be righteous, and then therefore buying an indulgence, doing penance, is a righteous act. It is a good act, and that is part of what you need to do to become good. And Luther's whole point is no. It is something that we receive by God's grace. We receive it passively. So is penance important? Yes, it's important, but not because it makes us good. So this is a whole kind of pastoral theological approach to the sacrament of penance is what this was all about. Not about the papacy, but it became that. It became about the power of the papacy. And Luther is rather surprised and shocked, and that is why it became the powder keg that lit the whole issue. Now, what was going on at the time was that the Pope, as I think I said, at first just thought this was a squabble between a Dominican. Tetzel was Dominican and an Augustinian, and not all that interested. And I think I even pointed out that he already made a deal with um, Maximilian, Emperor Maximilian, about handing over Luther because like, okay, he's becoming popular. It begins to be a real mess, and so let's kind of deal with this once and for all, not worry about it. So Maximilian, okay, will you handle it? Yeah, okay, fine. We go for it, and we work out a deal. Then Maximilian dies. Charles I is elected, and then it's like, what do we do? In that process, I think I mentioned the Pope. Um, said, I don't want Charles. So he even approached Frederick the Wise to say, will you run for emperor? I'll finance you. Don't have to worry about that. And you can name anyone you want as cardinal. Now, at the time, who would Frederick have named as cardinal? It would have been Luther, of course. Luther was the theologian at his university, the professor of the Bible at his own University of Wittenberg that he had established. And he was the one that made Wittenberg a famous name by 1518, 1519. Before it was this backwards little dinky new university that Frederick had established. And all of a sudden, it's making waves throughout Europe. And the Pope knew that. That just goes to show, how little the Pope really cared about Luther or what was the indulgences controversy as such. But Frederick, again, I think I may have already said this, was not called the Wise for nothing. He didn't want to be emperor. He says, no, Charles is elected. And then we have this controversy that is, spreading by the day. And every day that it's not stopped, it gets more intense and more problematic and more difficult to deal with. Now, I have up here mid-February 1520, Luther reads Hus's On the Church. That became his first discovery. I said there's two discoveries in 1520 that led to his break from Rome, and this is the first one. But before then, in a couple discussions with papal theologians, Johannes Eck being one, Cardinal Aleander is the other one. Eck, who was actually a brilliant theologian, and Sylvester Prierias, Dominicanus too, made discussions with. And Prierias was a brilliant theologian too. They really knew their stuff, and they were somewhat, unlike Tetzel, they were somewhat, say, okay, Martin, maybe do you have a point? Let's talk about this. But Eck said, what you're advocating, really, in terms of the papacy, is the same as what Jan Hus argued. So you're a Hussite in your view of the church. And that shocked Luther because he says, I will never be a heretic. That's what he says over and over again. I will never be a heretic. How dare you say that I'm a Hussite? The problem was, Luther was a Hussite. And I talk about this in chapter 7 in terms of his ecclesiology and context. But Luther had never read Huss. He knew Huss was a heretic. He knew Huss had been burned at the Council of Constance. That wasn't the problem or the issue. But he said, all of a sudden you're equating me with a heretic? I'm not a heretic. I will never be a heretic. Luther still writes to the Pope to judge his theses against indulgences because Luther believes that the problem are these papal theologians, Eck and Prierias and Aleander, and not the Pope himself. So he says, Pope, please just read my theses. I will acknowledge your judgment as the voice of Christ speaking through you. That was in 1518. And again in 1519, he pleads one more time with the Pope, Leo X, the Medici Pope. He says, just please read them. He says, don't believe all these people that you're hearing about how I'm against the Pope and the Church. He says, I place nothing higher than the authority of our Mother, Holy Mother Church, and of you as the Pope, except for Christ. Now, that was part of his vows. He didn't vow obedience to the Pope. He didn't vow obedience to the Church. He vowed obedience to Christ and to Mary and to the prior general of the Augustinian order. You remember back when I tried to stress that, and this is important. But Luther said, I am just trying to save Germany from this foreign avarice, as he puts it. i.e., from the Italian avarice trying to fleece Germany, tax Germany basically, to pay for the buildings of St. Peter's. And he says, that's what this is all about. I'm trying to stand up for the authority and the beauty of the church and not let it be corrupted by these Italian theologians. Now, the Pope obviously is not a theologian, basically, Leo X, he's a Medici prince. So that's what this conflict was about. And it was a shock to Luther to be accused of being a Hussite. But then he thought, basically, maybe I should actually read Huss to see. And he starts reading Huss's De Ecclesia on the church. And he writes to Georg Spalatin, who's like the Secretary of State, so to speak, of Frederick the Wise, the Elector. Luther did most of his business with the Elector through Spalatin. They became rather close. Luther did have contact directly with Frederick, but not very much. And so Luther also could be more open with Spalatin, Georg Spalatin, than he was when he was addressing the Elector directly. With Spalatin, he says, I've been reading Huss's De Ecclesia. And oh my God, you would be shocked to see the level of Roman perfidy, that the true gospel has been burned, i.e. Huss's position, as a heretic. He says, we're all Hussites. I'm a Hussite. Staupitz is a Hussite, his superior in the order and father kind of confessor figure who got them all started. And so is Augustine and even St. Paul. We're all Hussites. Hussites to the letter, he says. He says, the woe of the world. And actually, the woe of the world is the chapter title for chapter 7 in my book. And that shook Luther to his core. Probably a week later or so, he had another discovery that was the last straw. And that was that he read the Lorenzo Valla's refutation of the donation of Constantine. And I have up there the straw that broke the camel's back, much ado about nothing, Lord von Hutten. That's kind of in reverse order, actually. Those bullet points, I should have inverted them all. Because what was this treatise that Luther read that was so shocking to him, too? After the first kind of he got a double barrel. The first barrel shotgun was reading Huss, and this was the second. In the mid-15th century, Lorenzo Valla, who was an Italian humanist, wrote a treatise in Latin showing and demonstrating that the donation of Constantine, which was a document, was a forgery. Now, the donation of Constantine was a document supposedly issued by the Emperor Constantine back in the 4th century, granting temporal rule over the west part of the empire to the Pope, to the Bishop of Rome, when Constantine left and moved to Constantinople, his new city that he had established. The document is a fake. Now, Valla, with great erudition and philological intelligence or smartness or brilliance, proved that there were Latin words and phrases in the document that could not have been written in the 4th century. Language changes. And this is, in some ways, part of the impact of humanism, Renaissance humanism, because it focused on philology and textual analysis. We think of as kind of arcane and not really all that relevant to a lot of stuff, but this shows that it was, because Valla proved it. This document was a forgery. It circulated among other humanists, and they thought, good for you, Lorenzo Valla. You really showed your stuff. Wow, this is impressive. But it didn't have that big of an impact. Now, I have it there, much ado about nothing. Why? Because, number one, no one really based their political opinion or position on the donation of Constantine. Papacy didn't. Augustinus of Ancona said, well, if it is genuine, and this is before Valla, Augustinus was writing before Valen. He even questions the legitimacy of it. He says, if it's legitimate, it actually demonstrates that Constantine was the first legitimate Roman emperor because he's just acknowledging a right that was always there, that the Pope did have jurisdiction over the West and over the empire. So Constantine had not granted him jurisdiction, he was returning rightful rulership. Marcellus of Padua, against whom Augustinus was writing, also questioned the authenticity. But his take was, if it is genuine, it shows that if the Pope has any temporal jurisdiction whatsoever, it's only because the emperor grants it to him, and if the emperor grants it to him, the emperor can take it away. So that was what the debate was about. It wasn't the foundation of papal hierocratic theory, as it's so often been said. The papacy didn't build their arguments on the donation of Constantine. And Lorenzo Valla's refutation circulated among other Italian humanists as a demonstration of what a great job humanist studies, philology, textual scholarship of what it can do. Until in the early 16th century, a German humanist named Ulrich von Hutten, who was a knight, an imperial knight, so he was a lower level nobleman, but also then was humanistically trained and had humanist interests. He comes across Lorenzo Valla's treatise and reads it and thought, oh my God, this is fantastic. This shows that the papacy is based upon this donation that is a forgery. So it's based on absolutely nothing. And what von Hutten does is translates it into German, has it printed, and off it goes as an attack against the papacy. And why? Because this is just when the Germans are struggling with the Italians and the Pope and the papacy within the context of the indulgence controversy, but not just that in general, but especially within the indulgence issue of being fleeced and feeling fleeced. As I said, Luther was not the only one. There was, all kinds of people that were stood up against what they felt was the Pope and therefore the Italians unjustly treating the Germans and the German church. And on February 24th, Luther wrote a letter dated February 24th to Agintus Palatine. He'd just written him a week or so earlier, a week to 10 days earlier, about his discovery about Huss and how he was a Hussite, as was Paul, Augustine, Staupitz, everybody. It shook him to the bone. And then he reads, he says, I have on my desk here the refutation of the donation of Constantine by Lorenzo Valla as edited by Hutten. I'm not sure if he read, I think it was, he probably read the Latin, because Hutten did both, published it both in the Latin and the German, I'm pretty sure, but he may have written it in German, but anyway. But Luther was like, oh my God, again. He says, I'm so shook into the very depths of my bones, I don't know what to do. The Roman lies and perfidy have been passed down. I can scarcely now not believe that the Pope is that very Antichrist, which we all know we should be expecting and waiting for, because it all fits with what he does, with what he says, and how he acts. Now, the Pope had been called the Antichrist before. I think I mentioned that. Louis of Bavaria referred to the Pope as Antichrist in his Sachsenhausen appeal, or at least the Franciscan insert in Louis of Bavaria's Sachsenhausen appeal referred to the Pope as Antichrist, John the 22nd. It was a way to politically and rhetorically denigrate a Pope you didn't agree with. To my knowledge, I don't think Boniface VIII was called the Antichrist, but everything else but John the 22nd was. I mean, it's pretty harsh term, but it is part of, let's say, the late medieval critique against the papacy or against the Pope. Against the Pope. Because could there be bad popes? As Augustinus of Ancona argued, absolutely there could be bad popes. There have been bad popes. The bad popes you still must follow, but you don't follow the Antichrist. Now, what shook Luther so desperately was not that the Pope was the Antichrist. That was the medieval critique. Oh my God, the Antichrist is sitting on St. Peter's throne. What shook Luther was that for him this meant the papacy was the Antichrist. It wasn't that the Antichrist was sitting on St. Peter's throne as someone, having kind of invaded and taken over. No, Luther says, it is the throne of Antichrist itself. St. Peter's Cathedra in Rome is the throne of Antichrist. It's not the Pope himself, it's the papacy. Luther can still, after this discovery, write to Pope Leo X in honorific terms, as he does. But the tone has shifted from his earlier appeals to Leo to read his theses and acknowledge him as the voice of Christ speaking through you. Now, after this, Luther writes to Leo one last time, saying, blessed Leo, you are being deceived. You are basically, a sheep within the lion's den. Get out. I can help you. He was concerned for the person, because the institution of the papacy, Luther had seen, was the throne of Antichrist, and that had to be countered at all costs. That was the shock. That was the depth. Not just the individual sitting on the throne, but the throne itself, the institution of the papacy itself. Luther ended that letter to Spalatin. He says, I will do whatever I can. And that led to his three great treatises of 1520. However, here next the Reformation begins with Luther still, Brother Martin Luther Augustinian. And that is, even though now he had set himself against the papacy, therefore against the Roman Church as an institution, he still was held by his vows to the order. He was still wearing his habit. And he starts writing against the church. His appeals to Leo to kind of get out of there went nowhere. And in June, Leo issued the bull Exsurge Domini, Arise, O Lord, threatening Luther with excommunication if he didn't recant everything he had said and appeal to papal authority. Luther burned the bull in Wittenberg along with copies of canon law. And in August of 1520 appeared his address to the Christian nobility of the German nation. September 1520, the Babylonian captivity of the church. And in October 1520, on Christian liberty, also known as on the freedom of the Christian. So much for recanting. These three treatises, his famous three treatises of 1520, were an all-out attack on Rome and the Roman Church. And we'll read the address to the Christian nobility. It's a call to arms. It's a call to arms against the institution of the papacy. So is his Babylonian captivity, and that's not an original term with Luther. I think I mentioned this before, that Petrarch, Francesco Petrarca, the father of Italian humanism, so to speak, back in the 14th century had referred to the Albigenese papacy as the Babylonian captivity. Luther did too, but he meant something even worse by it, or more dire by it. And it is on the freedom of the Christian. And all three treatises are central to understanding Luther, and all three have been greatly misunderstood. And I'll be talking about on the freedom of the Christian a little bit later when we talk about the Peasants' War, 1525, because there Luther was appalled that, in his view, the peasants had so misunderstood his understanding of what Christian freedom actually was. It wasn't freedom from servitude. It wasn't freedom, social freedom or political freedom. It was the freedom of your conscience and your freedom to stand up for what's right against anybody else. Now, this freedom of conscience is a big issue. We'll be talking about this. I might talk more about the Diet of Worms. Too much has been made out of it. And I'll get back to that when I talk about the Diet of Worms very shortly. Because Luther's attack, just think about how Leo would have responded to it. Because he's aware of these treatises anyway. So on January 30, he issues the Bull of Excommunication, Decet Romanum Pontificem, whereby Luther is condemned as a heretic. His works are to be confiscated and burned. He is to be captured and sent to Rome for trial of heresy. And everyone knows what the outcome would be. But now we are already, 3.5 years or so after the outbreak of the indulgences controversy. It is widely known that there are problems and issues. The opposition to the Italians and to the Rome and the Pope by the Germans was huge. Charles the Fifth had recently been elected, 1519. He's a 19-year-old kid basically, and he's stuck with all this. What do we do? With the instigation of Frederick the Wise and some of the other German princes appealing to Charles, they said, let's deal with this Luther issue on German soil. Don't send him off to Rome. This is Rome trying to railroad us Germans. Let's deal with the issue here. We have an upcoming imperial diet, meeting of the imperial legislature, the Reichstag. Let's deal with it there. And Charles was agreeable to that. The Reichstag met from January to May 1521, and Luther appealed, I think, towards the end of April. I forget exactly when it was. And so, somewhat reluctantly, Charles said, "Okay, we'll do that. We're not just going to go, haul him off and send him off to Rome. We'll evaluate this matter here first, anyway." So, Charles issues an invitation to Luther to come to the Diet in Worms because they want to talk to him. Luther, especially after having actually read Hus's on the Church, knew a bit more about the whole controversy, and I don't know if he had known this before, but he certainly did by this time, that Emperor Sigismund had promised Hus safe conduct to and from the council. Well, Charles V was promising Luther safe conduct. Why? Because he was already under papal excommunication. He was supposed to be captured and sent off. Some rogue person might have tried to capture him and sent him to Rome to be in obedience with the Pope. So Charles says, no, by imperial authority, I grant you safe conduct to come to Worms. And I'll grant you safe conduct back. At least out of the city of Worms. Don't get there. Luther went out of obedience to the imperial request, knowing in his heart that he was going to his death, knowing what had happened to Hus. So he goes to Worms. He's brought before the imperial legislature, the imperial Reichstag. There's a book with all of his published works there, by which time there had been a lot. Luther was the most popular author there was at the time. A lot of editions, was spreading all over. We'll talk more about that in the next further lecture later on. And he was asked, "Are these your works?" He said, "Yes." Looking at them, I think these are my works. "Do you recant them?" He said, well, can I go through them? Because there may be things that I'd be willing to recant. He goes, "I've written these over a period of years, and I might go back and look and say, oh, yeah, that probably I'm willing to recant that. That wasn't formulated quite so right. If I can go through them kind of line by line, everything, we'll see." And they said, "No, You either have to recant all of them and completely in total here and now, or none. And Luther took a big, deep breath and said, I need to think about this. So I said, okay, go sleep on it, and we'll expect your answer tomorrow. Luther does. He's come back. He's asked, do you recant? And Luther said, I might be willing to recant some things, but also I've said a lot of very important, very good things here. And unless that I can be convinced by Scripture that I am wrong, it would be to go against my conscience to recant. Therefore, I will not and cannot, or I cannot and will not recant. God help me. Amen. Later, I forget exactly when, some 50 years later, in Lutheran tradition, the phrase, here I stand, was added to that stance before Worms. So that Luther said, I cannot and will not recant. God help, here I stand. God help me. Amen. It was not Luther, nor was his appealing to his conscience a new, modern individuality. It was standard medieval moral theology. Our conscience is that which tells us right from wrong, that little spark in our head where we get, or that feeling in our gut when we say, oh, I really shouldn't be doing this, but I'm going to do it anyway. Is that knowing what is right and wrong? It's called the synteresis in medieval psychological discussions, that little spark of, of the soul that didn't, or wasn't at least completely corrupted by the fall. The still is that, prick of conscience that, oh, I really shouldn't be doing this. And the position was, it is always sinful to go against your conscience. Even if you're wrong. Even if you're wrong. You're then doubly wrong if you act against your conscience. So Luther's appealing to his conscience was not some modern individualism based on humanistic ideas, which is just utter nonsense. It was appealing to standard accepted medieval psychological and moral theological practice. And everybody knew that. He was just saying, unless I could be convinced by Scripture. And that was the problem. That's the problem with Luther a lot. How could you convince Luther based on Scripture? He claimed that his opponents didn't know anything about the Bible. Well, if you read, as I have, Eck and Prierias, their treatises against Luther, their discussions of Luther, they cite scriptures all over the place. They know their scriptures as well as does Luther. It's how do you interpret it? What do you make of it? What is the meaning behind it? Luther certainly had this sense of, I am right. I know I am right. But it's not because his opponents didn't know Scripture, even though he claimed that. There was a certitude with Luther. How and why that came about, I talk a little bit about that in one of the chapters, his ways of thought. It goes back to the external righteousness, his understanding of external righteousness with Christ as our righteousness. And for him, his understanding of the scriptures, which then he said he got that insight with his revelation of passive righteousness. He said it opened all the scriptures to him. He became known as the Scopus Scripturae, the Scopus, which was a humanist literary technique of interpreting a text. Once you have that main idea, the Scopus, that helps you interpret all of the text. That was Luther's point. He had found his Scopus, the passive righteousness, and that was the key to open up all of the scriptures. He was convinced of that. Now, Charles V said, Martin, how can you be alone right and 1,000 years of Christian tradition be wrong? Therefore, I condemn you as a heretic. Your writings are to be confiscated and burned, and you are to be handed over to Rome to face trial for heresy. But I've granted you safe conduct out of Worms. You may leave. And Luther then does. He starts making the trek back to Wittenberg. Once he gets out of the walls of Worms, crosses over just into open territory, he knows he's now open to capture. And he was. He was captured. Captured, a sack was put over his head, thrown into a wagon, and off he was whisked. He knew this was it. He was heading to Rome to meet his death, basically. When the wagon finally stopped, took him out, brought him in to a building. Luther didn't know where he was. Luther had been kidnapped by Frederick the Wise, his own prince, to protect him, and had been whisked off to one of Frederick's castles in what's called the Wartburg, up in the Harz Mountains. Beautiful area. The Wartburg. There, Frederick protected Luther to keep him from being kidnapped by somebody else and sent off to Rome. Frederick said, no, we're not going to do this. We're not going to railroad this guy. He's my theologian, after all. He's what made Wittenberg famous. Now, Luther's colleagues back in Wittenberg didn't know where he was for quite a while. They thought he had been captured and taken to Rome. But there in the Wartburg, Luther stayed. Now, I will get back to what happens next, but that is kind of where the story ends here and now. And the issue is that when he's there in the Wartburg, too, he's still an Augustinian. He's still an Augustinian hermit. When he's standing before Worms, he's still an Augustinian hermit, wearing his habit. And I talk more about that in my book. It becomes very kind of complex, but it's there. So when does he stop being? If 1520 is when he breaks from Rome, why does he still wear the habit? And when does he stop? Well, there's a lot of developments between 1521 and Worms and 1524. Here, Luther takes off his habit. So I'm skipping over that, and I'll come back and fill those in the next several lectures. Luther had always referred to himself as Brother Martin Luther Augustinian, or as, Martin Luther Augustinian. He stops referring him to that. He even talks about he's reluctant to take off his habit, and he's hearing about monks leaving the monastery. He goes, at one point he says, I will stay in this habit and way of life unless the world completely changes. That's after all of this. So before 1524, 1523, I think so. Well, the world completely changed because in October 1524, Luther finally takes off his habit. He's no longer an Augustinian. He's no longer even associating himself with the Roman Church. But that break only came in 1520 with his two great discoveries. His discovery of being a Hussite and his discovery of the donation of Constantine being a forgery. The shock that was. Now, that's where we stand for now. We'll continue with this as we go through things. We'll continue in a later lecture, too, to see the origins of Protestantism, because even after 1524, Luther is not a Protestant yet. But we'll get there when we get there. He's against Rome. He's protesting against Rome, but he's not a Protestant yet. But we'll get to that understanding of what the term Protestant originally meant in the context. For now, Luther's an evangelical. That was what the Luther faction became known as. Or by the opponents, the Lutherans, the Lutherani, were seen as this denigrating term. The Lutherans. But Luther never referred to himself as that. So we are the evangelicals, those who are standing up for the true gospel. The true gospel. Now, that term of evangelical has nothing to do with the term evangelical today as it's being used. For Luther, it's simply basing everything on the gospel. Now, that being said, that's where we stop. We'll continue with the developments from the Wartburg, what's going on in Wittenberg, and how it all plays out in the next several lectures. Read the material for this week. I'll talk more about the address to the German nobility and text analysis too in the next lecture. And read the chapters. And I hope this lecture has helped you maybe get through reading the chapters in my Luther book so that they will complement each other. Okay, so thank you very much, and we'll continue with this story, which again, for me, I think is a fantastic story. Thank you so much. Bye bye.